To give public schools state money each year, Albany runs a bunch of numbers through a formula and it spits out a number. And that determines that this school gets X amount of dollars. Well, Governor Hochul is playing with that formula, and the number getting spit out at the end for some North Country school districts shows a cut in funding. That's not going over well. Here's 7 News reporter Lexi Bruning.
When Governor Kathy Hochul announced her proposed budget for next year, it was a bit of a blow for some North Country school districts.
We've not seen decreases in foundation aid the last several years, so this came as quite a shock to many.
Some districts may not get the hundreds of thousands of dollars in state aid they had budgeted for. A big reason for the change, Governor Hochul eliminated what is called the hold harmless provision.
A district that saw reductions in their student enrollment would not be harmed by that and would receive no less year over year than what they had.
According to the governor's proposal, the schools that are deemed wealthy will get less aid and those not deemed wealthy will get more. Todd calls it a skewed calculation.
Some of our districts, their apparent wealth is skewed by the fact that there is high-value property on the river or on the lake, much of it seasonal property.
One of the schools taking the hardest hit, Alexandria Central. It would see a decrease of more than $500,000 in state aid, a 13.2% change. Thousand Island Central School, a 12.3% decrease in funding. Lafargeville, a 1.3% loss, and Sackett's Harbor, a 4% loss. Alexandria Central, Thousand Islands, and Sackett's Harbor sent Assemblyman Scott Gray this letter asking for his support.
It is, I fairly safe to say that it has bipartisan pushback right now from both sides of the aisle.
Assemblyman Ken Blankenbush says communities would be forced to make tough decisions.
Our upstate school districts are going to have to prioritize where their money goes, and who's going to pick that up? Probably our local taxpayers.
But Todd says schools that have reached their tax cap aren't able to tax anymore.
Drastic cuts in the budget means typically staffing cuts, which typically means kids will not receive necessarily all of the services that the district knows they need and wants to provide.
While some schools are losing out on funding, others are getting more from the proposed distribution process. Watertown City School District would get more than $4.5 million. Lexi Bruning, 7 News.
Let's run the other counties now. According to numbers from the state, in St. Lawrence County, Canton is facing a 4.5% funding decrease. Clifton Fine, 24% decrease. Hammond, 10.7%. Morristown, a 6.5% decrease. And in Lewis County, Jefferson Lewis Bosse says all schools are getting more state aid. South Lewis, 7.3% more. You see Copenhagen, Lowville, and then Beaver River and Harrisville, 3.6% more as it stands right now.